Afternoon, everyone.
Hello.
Welcome to the webinar. Feel free to jump in the chat and go ahead and introduce yourself, where you're calling in from, any fun fact or something like that if you want to share.
Yeah. Jersey in the house.
Rainy Jersey. Yep, same here.
Philly. Jersey, Philly.
All right, Midwest representing. Good.
Chicago, Denver, Dallas, Maryland.
All right, this is one of the more geographically diverse sessions we've had, just based on the first few we've seen.
Yeah, man. Sacramento representing the West Coast. That's great.
Seems like most of you figured this out, but if you haven't already done it, go ahead into your chat and change the to function to everyone. Otherwise, you're just sending notes to Andrew and I, which won't be as fun for the rest of us. So it is 2 p.m. Eastern time now, so we'll give it another minute or so. People are still coming in, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Yeah. I love seeing where you're all from because it's just like all the good cities, like all the good cities. Indy, we got a Canada representing. This is great. I saw someone from Austin. What's up, Austin? That's where I am.
Land of Enchantment, New Mexico. That's great. That's like the license plate game, right? We have to go and figure out those little slogans for all the states.
Isn't New Mexico like the fourth biggest state by land area? I think maybe. Fun fact. I could be wrong about that, but I think it might be like fourth.
It's bigger than you would think. I knew that much. Right?
Yeah,
definitely. A lot of desert, yeah, for sure.
A lot of dessert too. I've had some good desserts in New Mexico.
All right, so let's go ahead and kind of ease into this. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, to our webinar. This is a little bit of a departure from the usual sort of how-to webinar related to analytics. Today is a partner webinar. We've invited our friends from Mighty Citizen to join us. And so what we're going to talk about today is content, right? That's why you've all joined. We're going to talk about taking charge of your content, how to know what you have, and how to improve it. And one of the ways that you do that is through content audit. So we'll spend a lot of time today talking about the process and the results, and as well as some of the why, for why you'd want to do a content audit. And so as we do that, keep in mind, right, content is not just the words on your website, right? It's pretty much everything that you produce as an association, right? It's your products, it's your services, publications, things like that. And the goal is not just to create great content, right? It's to advance the mission of your organization, it's to provide a great customer experience, and all the other goals that you have. And the content is just how we do that, right? So, and this is a really important topic for all of our usual attendees, right, who want to learn, who care a lot about data, because the types of content we create, the topics and themes that we emphasize, and the way that we deliver that content is, it all kind of revolves around data, right? So I am Bill Conforti, Senior VP of Strategy and Solutions with Association Analytics. Some of you know me from seeing me on webinars before. I've been doing this software products and services, for more than 20 years, 20 plus. Once you get past 20, it's just 20 plus, right? You don't say exactly how many it is after that, but it's getting on the downside of the 20 plus at this point. But been with A2 about 8 years and spent a lot of time with clients and prospects. Learned a lot about all of your issues and challenges with data, and content is a big part of that. So we're happy to be joined today by Andrew. So I'm going to turn it over to Andrew to introduce himself.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Andrew Buck. I am a content strategist at Mighty Citizen. Mighty Citizen is a design, marketing, and web agency that specializes in mission-driven organizations. We have a lot of association clients, and so that's why it's such a pleasure to be speaking with Association Analytics today. Yeah, I have about 20 years experience. Notice I don't have a plus. What does that mean? Bill is older than me in all likelihood. But I had to add this fun fact that this very morning, the dog that I have, I'm actually dog sitting, it's not my dog, decided to relieve himself on my modem, frying it instantly. And so a lot of scrambling this morning to make sure I had working internet for this, but shout out to AT&T for coming through in a clutch and getting me here. So yeah, real pleasure to be speaking to you all today. Association marketing and content is probably my favorite of the different sort of sectors or industries we work with at Mighty Citizen, only because it's just, there's nothing else like it. And increasingly, I'm convinced that associations are going to become an even more sort of stalwart cornerstone of the future economy. So what a pleasure it is to get to talk to a bunch of professionals who know this world inside and out. Okay, so quick agenda here. What we want by the end of this hour is for you to be able to do a few things. First is make a real good case for why content audits are important. Now, as Bill pointed out, everything you do is content, literally everything. It's kind of the whole point of an association, right? Is to develop knowledge, provide education, et cetera. We are really going to focus today, though, or at least my part is going to be really focused on website content. Websites often get overlooked and undervalued by organizations in general. In my experience, associations especially, in part because you're so complex and you serve different audiences. So I want to put our website content right back at the center of our content strategy where I think it belongs. We want to figure out how the content audit works within your content strategy. So it is a part, it's a tool, it's fuel really for your content strategy. And so we want to make sure we understand how it connects and how they serve each other. We're going to talk about how to actually find and use the data to identify what your content is, how it's performing, and what's most valuable. And finally, we'll wrap up by showing you an audit template that we've developed that we're going to share with you that you can use if you decide you want to undertake or revisit your content auditing process. Okay. So I was a debater in high school. If any fellow debaters shout out in the chat, let me know. And so I'm always obsessed with starting any sort of webinar or any sort of topic or presentation with defining our terms. And audit is an interesting one. This definition you see on your screen there is really sort of probably like, from the world of tax audit, right? It seems a little more financial in nature, but there's some interesting things here I want to point out. The first is organizations accounts. So this just is echoing what Bill started off by saying, like, again, everything is content. We're going to talk about websites mostly today, but it doesn't let you off the hook from keeping a keen, close eye on how your emails are performing, how your social is performing, how any print collateral is performing, the experience you develop at events, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's all content, right? Another word that's interesting here is the word inspection. So there is a difference between a content inventory and a content audit. An inventory really is just what it sounds like, right? It's a listing, for example, of all the pages that are live on your website right now. Inspection to me, and an audit specifically, is about really evaluating all of that content against certain metrics. Now, the ultimate metric we're evaluating against, of course, is our organization's goals. Like, what are we even doing here, right? What are we trying to achieve this quarter, this year? Hopefully that's documented. And so, but in between the content you create and the large organizational strategic goals, right? There's all these sort of little milestones. And so that's what an audit should allow you to do, is sort of bridge the gap between what you're publishing and how you're doing it and how you're promoting it. And is it really moving the needle where we want the needle moved? And then finally, we've got the word independent body. So of course you can conduct your own content audit. And if you absolutely can't get any sort of outside group to do it, then you should anyway, because there's value in it. But there's a lot more value, in my opinion, by having some independent body. Now, that independent body doesn't have to necessarily be like a vendor or consultant, although it could be, certainly. It could be some group of volunteers, perhaps. I mean, they're not fully independent, obviously. But the idea is we're trying to avoid something that I talk about all the time at Mighty Citizen, which is the curse of knowledge. Okay. So the curse of knowledge goes like this. Once you know something, it's impossible to imagine what it was like not to know that thing, right? Again, once you know something, it's impossible, right? Because that's how our brains work, to put yourself into the mind of someone who didn't or doesn't know that thing you know. Why is this critical? Well, for me, it's the definition of marketing, or the definition of marketing's primary challenge, I should say, which is you think about your association 40 plus hours per week. The people you're trying to connect with, engage with, get to take certain actions, they think about your association roughly 0 hours per week. So that means that you have this vast body of knowledge and context. That's a key word here too, right? Context. So anytime you write anything, publish anything, send an email, it's coming from a place of knowledge that they simply don't have. And therefore, it makes connection and comprehension a lot more difficult. And the worst part about the curse of knowledge is you're not even aware of it. That's why it's so important to have an independent body evaluate your content, because they're coming at it with sort of this Zen beginner mind, right? That your members or potential donors, or again, those people you're trying to engage have. You're simply unable, when you're sort of in it, to properly, objectively evaluate it. Okay, so that's what we're talking about today, right? An audit. Now, your typical content audit looks, this is a kind of a clip of one. It does go off to the right. I kind of clipped it off by a few columns, and I've seen some that are 50, 60 columns where each column represents a different metric. This is not what we're going to do today. In fact, we've developed a template that we think is a lot, I call it the usable template, because I feel like it's all usable. And the reason for that is because most website content audits don't get completed. They're too complicated, and they don't appropriately influence your content strategy. I've seen this time and time and time again with all sorts of organizations. They either do an audit themselves, or they ask, they hire Mighty Citizen to do it for them. We love doing them because it's a critical guide to everything that comes after, whether it's a website redesign, a new content strategy, copywriting, revised messaging, et cetera, et cetera. So we love doing it. But they often don't get completed when it's left to the organization themselves. And one reason for that is you might have 5,000 pages on your website. They're also way too complicated. Sort of the screen before this, where we're looking at all those columns, and again, they can go really, really long. The reason they don't get completed often is because they're too complicated, but even notwithstanding the completion rate, they're too complicated to be especially useful, because you're going to hear me say this a couple more times today, that if you do an audit well and you evaluate the right things, you can kind of begin to tell a clear story about the connection between the things you write and publish, the things you film and publish, the pictures you take and put out into the world, and the strategic goals of your association. So they're too complicated to be useful because we get too into the weeds and we focus on things that aren't important. And then again, we're going to talk in just a second about how once you do the audit, it should influence your content strategy. For example, at Mighty Citizen, one of the things we do all the time is we conduct really large scale user surveys on behalf of our clients to really get some information that we need. And we often talk about how you should never ask a question in a survey that you're not prepared to act on. In other words, it's not enough to be curious about something. If you're going to do the work of pursuing the data, developing the knowledge, then you need to be prepared to react to that and to not simply bury it or ignore it, right? Okay.
Andrew, quick question. Let me jump in for 1 sec here. So if I'm a customer and Mighty Citizen comes in and does a content audit for me, are there recommendations specifically, like what kinds of changes I should make? Is that part of the deliverable for the audit, or is it more like, hey, look, here are your results, and then I interpret them and take action on my own?
Yes and yes. It really depends on the project, but there's always specific recommendations. There's usually dozens, if not hundreds of them that are at the real tactical level, usually having to do with the web, social, and email.
Mhm.
If we're working on a project that has other deliverables, like we are doing a website redesign, or we are doing new messaging, or we're developing a whole new social media strategy, we're going to execute on that, then typically the audit is just an input to a larger set of recommendations later. But yes, that's the fun of audits, if you can believe me that they're fun, is that you're having to reckon with what you're publishing and ask yourself some specific questions about how it's doing what it's doing, and inevitably you come up with ideas for how to improve it. So yeah, great question.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to offer $500, not really, to anybody in the chat who can name who this is. Does anybody recognize this gentleman? I offered this once before and nobody knew. One of these days someone's going to know, and it's going to cost me. But the answer is a gentleman by the name of Vilfredo Pareto. Vilfredo was an incredible person. He was an Italian civil engineer, sociologist, economist, political scientist, philosopher, just a fascinating guy. But to the extent that you recognize his name, you might have heard of the Pareto Principle, often shorthanded to the 80-20 rule. And this is how it goes. The Pareto Principle, which he developed, says that 80% of outcomes are due to about 20% of causes. So you can see on the screen there some examples of that. For example, about 20% of criminals commit 80% of crimes. And the really fascinating one is that 20% of employees are responsible for 80% of results. We're all probably seeing that.
Okay, we're all in the 20%.
Yeah, I was going to say, we're thinking, which am I in? I hope it's the 20%. So why is this relevant here? Because when auditing your content, I think one reason that content audits aren't as useful as they should be is because we feel the need to evaluate everything. And while there is not a proven Pareto distribution between website usage and number of pages, in consulting with our digital marketing experts here at Mighty Citizen, they all kind of agree that roughly they believe, or it might even be more extreme, like 10% of your pages on your website are responsible for 90% of your results, or at least your traffic, right? So hopefully this begins to mitigate any growing anxiety you had, like, oh shoot, we have 5,000 pages. How am I going to look at each one and evaluate it against these different criteria? So there's a couple of things you can do there. The first is we really do want to really audit the pages that are producing the most results. And that doesn't necessarily mean the 20% most visited pages, because you might have some pages that get slightly less visits, but are having an outsized impact on your organizational goals. But generally speaking, if you go into your Google Analytics, you pull a simple report to show us the top 20% of our pages, there's a good chance that those pages account for the vast majority of your traffic, which means it doesn't necessarily mean you can ignore the other 80%, but it does mean you don't have to pay them attention nearly as regularly as you do your most popular pages. So the recommendation here from us would be to start there and audit those 20%. Now, some of you may be saying, but there's 5,000 pages on our site. 20% of that is still 1,000 pages. So then maybe we cut it down to 10% or 5%. It's more important to make the audit usable and impactful inside the organization than it is to fill in every box for every page, right? We want to make sure we're spending time on something that's going to have real results and obvious impact on our work and our plans, as opposed to just an intellectual exercise. So it's not so much a poll, but let's put it, I'm curious, in the chat, just a yes or no. Does your association have a content strategy document that you're currently using? No, this is a judgment-free zone. You're allowed to say no, and that's okay. But we're getting some yeses, some nos, mostly, I like that, mostly, pretty much, more or less, sort of, no.
So Andrew, while people are answering, I bet they're at least a few on here that are saying, well, we kind of have one, but it's not documented. So
Yeah.
my question to you would be, is that possible, right? Is the answer really, if I say it's not documented, is my answer really no? Or can we have a strategy, but just not have it documented?
You're putting me on the spot. Here's what I'll say. Generally, I would say, yeah, if it's not on paper, it doesn't exist. But I know I've been in really small, I worked for some small nonprofits early in my career where it was all in someone's head and it seemed to work more or less in their head. But yeah, the thing, well, in the next slide, we're going to talk more about what goes into a content strategy. If you don't have a documented content strategy, may I recommend that you pursue that? In part, well, there's a lot of benefits for it. And frankly, I think it's a lot of fun. But as we noted at the top today, associations are really fueled by content. The continuing education you develop, the certifications you provide, the member benefits, the events, it's all content. It's all some form of text and images put together. So if you document your content strategy, it frankly will be, well, first of all, it'll be just shocking. It'll be revealing. The process of developing a good content strategy is inevitably, in my experience anyway, a real eye-opener on many counts. But then you're going to actually be able to pursue it and stop pursuing things that aren't moving the needle. Without a documented content strategy, it's much easier to waste your time, money, and energy, in my opinion. Okay. So just a couple more things. I want to make sure we hand it over to Bill so he can talk to us about that actual data that we need, right? So some of you may have encountered this before, often called the content strategy quad, originally developed by Christina Halverson, who's sort of the godmother of web content strategy. And so we're borrowing it from her and her agency Brain Traffic, but it's just such a great breakdown. So in order to have a documented content strategy, you need to have these 4 things. And I want to talk about them just very briefly. So the first is substance, right? This is the question of what you have to say to the world. Another way of thinking about this is, frankly, is the readability of the prose and the quality of your images. Now, obviously, video is part of that too, if you're doing a lot of video. But of course, when we're talking about connecting with our members and potential members across the time and space that is the internet, it really comes down to words and pictures and how we put them together, how we format them. But mostly here, we're talking about what do we have to say to the world, and can we say it in a way that they understand and find irresistible, okay? Very closely related to that is the structure of your content. In other words, what are the form factors in which your content appears in the world, especially online? So it's location, form, and again, findability here. Findability is critical. If you don't have a content strategy, I'm guessing you might not also have a search engine optimization strategy. And may I recommend you get one of those, in part because it's only going to become more important that you become findable. It's more important literally every 60 seconds, because the amount of content that is out there competing with your association is growing by like I don't know, tetrabytes per day or something ridiculous. So we got to have something good to say, and we got to say it in interesting ways and in interesting places and in ways that people can find and want to find. Then we have workflow. So this one probably is a little more self-evident just based on the name, right? Who makes content decision and who contributes? I think some things that I've seen other agencies do when they're developing workflows for an organization is they focus on the steps between coming up with an idea for something to create and actually putting it out into the world. And I think that's obviously critical. What I think they often overlook, though, is the importance of authority within your association. In other words, do you or does anyone, any one person, have the ability to say, yes, we are going to make that, and that is my decision that we're going to make that. If you haven't invested that authority in whether it's a marketing director or communications director, whatever you call it, then it's going to be pretty impossible for you to fully execute on a robust, dynamic, effective content strategy. It just is, because what ends up happening is everything slows down, everything gets confused, the quality of the product goes down as we ensure that all content decisions have to become more and more decentralized. So that's me soapboxing a little bit, I'll admit. And then finally here, governance. Governance is basically trying to answer the question, are we spending our time on the right stuff and are we sharing it in the best ways? So while workflow is about the day-to-day process of ensuring our website is accurate and interesting and findable and beautiful, all things we should be doing, governance is sitting up above, making sure that a month from now, a quarter from now, a year from now, we're going to be on the right track. We're going to be doing the things we should be doing. So if you have all four of these, you have a content strategy. Now, how does the audit work in it? Well, first, when it comes to substance, in order to audit your content, you have to actually look at it. And for many of you, you probably haven't looked at certain pages on your website, maybe ever, or certainly in a long time. So you actually have to sit there and read it. So you're gonna have to do that. You're gonna have to look at it, you're gonna have to read it, you're gonna have to interact with it. With structure, an audit helps, ideally by doing some usability testing. Now, there are other ways that the audit can inform structure, like Bill asked earlier, like, are you making recommendations as your audit? Well, of course, it's inevitable. You're going to go to some page on your site and you're going to be like, oh, this picture makes no sense here, or why is this video got a weird thumbnail? Or, God, this thing seems a little incomplete, or this thing is way inaccurate, or this date is out of date, or whatever. So you're going to be coming up with these as you go. Usability testing is when you take real users, ask them to do things on your website, and closely observe them as they do it. It's something we do a lot here at Mighty Citizen, because you'd be shocked at how that curse of knowledge can be so insidious, because it can prevent you from even seeing how people look at your website, like what your menu looks like to them, and do they understand where the button is, and why isn't there a button? Usability testing inevitably reveals countless opportunities to make your website, frankly, more usable. Here's one other thing I'll say real quick. It doesn't matter how compelling your association's message is, your case for support, as some of us may call it. It doesn't matter how beautifully it's written, how lovely the videos you produce are, whatever, if the structures you put it in are unusable or unfindable. So that's why these are so closely married. Next, when you are developing your audit, it can be helpful, although I think it's a little less important than other things, but if you can, you want to list all the people involved in the creation of that web page. Usually that involves the person who had the idea that we need that page, the person who wrote it or persons who contributed to the writing, anyone who edited that, anyone who took a picture, anyone who bought a picture from a stock, anyone who created the video, anyone in leadership who signs off. If you have to have legal look at things, you want to list all those people so you can begin to develop a clear sense of the process by which your content moves through your organization, so that hopefully you can make it move quicker and better and remove those bottlenecks. And then, yeah.
Sorry, Andy, that sounds like a lot of work. I mean, that's a lot of people to list times those 1,000 pages. Are we really supposed to do that for every single page?
Yeah. I know it sounds like a bummer. That's why you want to get someone else to do it. Ideally, you say you go do it, come back to us in a couple of weeks and tell us all the cool things you learned. But listen, one shortcut here is, and we'll see this when we look at the template, that one thing you're always identifying, we want to start thinking in content types a little less than we're thinking about web pages. Now, the way we view our website is through pages, but we can start thinking about content type. So if you don't want to repeat yourself, you can say every time we have an event, which is a content type, right? We have an event listing on our site. These are the people that are involved in the event coordinator, the education person, whoever it is. So you can kind of take a shortcut and not have to repeat yourself every time. You can just do it by content type if you want to save yourself some time.
Awesome. Great.
And then finally, governance. So the audit should set the stage to allow you to tell a story to your committee. You're like, who's the committee? Well, I'm not going to digress here, but needless to say, you need a content governance committee. It's something we always put into our content governance plans for our clients, because you need a body that is disinterested and frankly is outside of marketing and development. You don't want those people on your committee, because you need people who are close to your users, because marketing is not as close to your users as other parts of your association typically. So you need this committee, and you need to be able to bring an audit to them roughly once a year. I'd say maybe once a half a year, to say, we've audited a portion of our website, the most important sections of our site, most important pages and content types. And this is what we're seeing. People kind of like this, they love this, they hate this, they can't find this, et cetera, et cetera. So you're beginning to tell a story so that you can get the resources and direction you need to improve. Okay, so now Bill, I'm going to put you on the spot and hand it over to you. And I know you wanted to start by asking us a question. He's going to take control of the screen here.
I am. Give me one sec. Okay, so we're going to start with how does your association decide which content to produce and which content to prioritize? So just answer in the chat here. So just so you know, some of the answers that we get typically are that each department does its own, just judgment, professional judgment. The executive team decides. We do surveys, or we do analysis. Maybe we look at our website data, our community data, things like that. And then while you're answering, I want to plug something that's going to happen at the end. Andrew's going to show you a template on how to do all this. And as we were talking about, the audit process and the strategy process, it made me think a lot of what we talk about very often in the data world, which is data governance. And data governance is this big, hairy thing that takes years and years to do. And consequently, a lot of associations don't do it, or they don't do it very well. And so what we've tried to do is really slim that down into a very approachable, very lightweight framework for governance. And that way, it's just not so scary, right? And that's something that you can take on. So I want to, to promote the template as a way to do this in a lightweight fashion, right? So the communications team does it, decided on by board members, association vision, industry needs, right? So all of this means that we're deciding on these kinds of issues, with a combination of judgment and experience, as well as looking at data, right? Because as Andrew said, we really just don't have the time and resources to spend on content that's going to be ineffective. Okay, so when it comes to data-informed content planning, to what extent does your association use data to inform content decisions, right? So if that strikes you, you can also answer that one in the chat. This is a question that we've asked previously, and what we found is that more than 80% of those who respond to this use data at least some of the time for their content decisions, right? So, and one of the things that we found, because I'm sure that we have a wide range of different shapes and sizes of associations. Johanna says hardly ever. Yeah, so you'd be in the minority here. But we look at large and small, and that 80% was pretty consistent across both of those. So if you're small and you're thinking that, hey, look, this is not for us, we're too small, no excuses, right? This is for everyone. So so we're association analytics. We talk about data all the time, and so not surprisingly, I'm going to make the case to you that data is going to be key for all of this. So what we're really looking at is this sort of cycle, and this representation, this image is kind of common in analytics, where you have the blue arrows kind of represent your data, right? And you have strategy at the top, where you're asking questions like, what are the issues and topics that are important to our mission, that resonate with our members and our customers, and what kinds of content should we even create, right? Should it just be all documents? Should we do podcasts? Should we do videos, right? Should we do all of the above? Should we spend a lot of money on publications, or is that something that's not going to be valuable for members, right? So this is our content strategy. Now, next we have to do the audit, right? So we've spent some time and effort to create some content, right? So if you're going to do an audit, it's because you already have a bunch of content and you haven't really done that yet. So now we're going to ask, well, what do we have? Where is it? All of this kind of things. Who created it, and who was responsible for that? What's the level of quality? What's the level of accessibility of that content, right? So how good is it, and can we find it, right? Because no matter how good it is, if you can't find it, right, it's obviously not going to move the needle. It's not going to create the results that you want. And lastly, what improvements are recommended, right, based on the audit? And that can be things that you get explicitly from a vendor or a partner like Mighty Citizen, or it might be just things that you arrive at naturally based on an audit that you would do internally. And then based on that, and sort of in this cycle, we do analysis, right? So in our analysis, here's where we're asking questions like, well, how does our content perform, right? Where should we invest in and where should we divest? I mean, so where should we be spending that limited amount of time and effort that we have? And how can we optimize delivery? So this is an important point because a lot of what we talk about today is content that's just on your site, right? So you kind of rely on members to go and find that content, right? So it has to be accessible, it has to be findable. You have to have a proper site structure and maybe a search that's helpful for the customers and all of that. Very important. However, in the real world, what you're really trying to do as well is reach out to customers and members as well. So it's not just allowing them to find it, but it's about proactively pushing that content to them in a lot of cases. So how can we deliver it? How can we land it in their inbox at a time that's appropriate and with some relevant content that they care about, right? So, like with almost everything else that we do in life and in our associations, certainly data is really going to be key. So this is what we're looking at now is kind of a framework that we've looked at before. And the idea here is that your content and particular relevant content really drives engagement. And so there's a couple of interesting parts to this. Right? First, we have to collect the data. We have to do that as deliberately and comprehensively as we can. We have to sort of ask customers what they want and observe how it is they consume it, right? So here we're talking about collecting the data about the content itself. And then we have to organize, and organize refers to the content itself as well as the data about that content. We have to integrate it, right? That's something that we talk about very often, is the need for that sort of trusted source of data across your association. And I mean, almost the most important part of that is the data about your content, right? The content itself, and then all the data about how it's consumed, because that is what allows you to make those recommendations and to take action. Then inside a tool like Acumen, that's our data analytics platform. That's where you visualize and you do the visualizations for the purposes of analysis, and you do the analysis obviously with the purpose ultimately of taking action. And like with every webinar topic ever, right? If you don't take action at the end, then you've kind of wasted a lot of time. So we want to make sure that we don't forget to act on things, right? We don't want to do the audit and then never take any action or implement those recommendations. So really quick, I'm going to just talk about each one of these things here. So organization, I want to take a minute to, right? So we're really talking about a content audit here, right? But you can't really fully embrace the content audit process if you haven't at least thought about a content strategy, right? And the part where you analyze and you make recommendations and you make improvements, that kind of relies on a taxonomy, right? So that can be a whole webinar, a whole hour, all by itself, but here we're talking about, and very commonly starts with the website, right? So this is a good time to talk about. You have a taxonomy of all of the content on your site, but what I would suggest is that taxonomy can be used across all of the content throughout the organization, because that's going to allow you to analyze performance. So we don't want to, sorry about that. We don't just want to analyze performance across everything, but we want to analyze it in pieces or in segments, right? So maybe we want to look at not just our events data, but events related to a specific class of events or even a particular event, right? So do our members like, content on all fruits and vegetables, or do they like content about specific variety of potatoes or something like that, right? So the idea is that we know the right level of granularity where we're analyzing that performance. We need to be able to target and personalize, based on those preferences and interests. So where we want to get to is everything that I do on the site or in other touch points with your members, that tells you something specific about my preferences and about my interests. And that kind of feeds into that cycle that we talked about for what kind of content you want to make available to me and what kinds you want to deliver to me as well. Okay, so we're going to collect, right? How do we collect the data? Two ways broadly, right? But there are other ways, but we have to ask, and we can do that through surveys, through evaluations. We can have forms on our website. Occasionally there's actually asking people in person in some cases, but we're going to ask members or ask customers what kinds of content they want. And the other way we do it is we observe, right? So we observe engagement, right? We've talked a lot about that in other webinars. We look at purchases, we look at downloads, discussions, but then we also look at things like searches and page views, right? So when you try to pick that 20% or that 10% of content you're going to focus on, a lot of it is based on your observation of how that content is consumed, right? Which pages on your site get the most visits. Maybe you look at things like the length of time spent on the site. Maybe you look at which ones get the most return users, right? So maybe you focus on those versus the ones that are popular with first-time visitors, or vice versa, right? All of that is somewhat subjective, but the point is that you have good tools. You have Google Analytics, right? You maybe have some kind of data repository like Acumen that integrates or aggregates your engagement data, and you want to look at that and use those observations to drive your decisions, right? We're going to integrate them in a central repository. So when it comes to these kind of decisions, you want to be as comprehensive with your data as possible, and that's so both like profile data, about the individual's customers, but also how they behave, right? Okay, so the last few things on our framework were visualize, analyze, and act. So let's kind of take a quick look at how that works. So we start off, we have all these customers or members, and we have some content, and we have some ideas or some ideas about content, but there's not really much connection between the two. And we can look at that in terms of like a macro level and a micro level, right? So at the macro level, we're looking across all of our populations, across all the segments, and maybe it's our entire customer base. And so really we're asking here is like, what kinds of products and services should we offer, right? What content? And so that's maybe at the higher strategy level. And then once we do that, we can start to explore that, based on things like demographics and behaviors, right? So that's when a tool that aggregates this sort of stuff is really valuable. So it's not just which pages and which content are most popular, but it's which pages and content are most popular with particular segments of our audience. So you end up with something more like this. It's not just one sort of homogenous group of individuals and another homogenous group of content sort of sitting next to each other. It's really it's these red guys here that like this particular type of content or this delivery method, right? It's the black ones that like this type. It's the blue and yellow that like this type. And what we're able to do is like each one of those colors can represent really anything that binds people in that segment together, right? So it might be a demographic, it might be a preference, it might be an interest, but we use that information and we optimize that segmentation to not only understand what we should create, but how we should deliver it, right? So it's not just putting it up on our site and waiting for people to find it. We also have campaigns, we have promotions, we have messaging, right, that we send out through our email marketing system or through our social campaigns. We have, the way that we curate our content, which things are promoted or emphasized, all that kind of stuff. That takes advantage of that optimization, right? So it's not just that one single message that we're blasting out to everyone and hoping, right, that certain things stick. Okay, so all of that ends up with engagement, and we can measure that, right? So all of those things lead to improved engagement, which can be measured. And as we know, again, another webinar for another time, if we're able to improve our engagement, then that correlates highly with all of the other things that we care about in our association, right? It helps us build our customer experience. It helps build loyalty. It helps to generate revenue across our events and across our membership, and just improve performance more broadly. So to wrap up, right, there's this process of continuous improvement, right? So we start out with the strategy, which leads us to create some content. We have to audit that content. We have to document those results. We have to take action based on those results, and then we have to analyze in the first place. But then, in particular, if we've made any changes, right, to our content, based on the audit, right? So maybe we want to look at the before and after in terms of those Google Analytics or those engagement metrics or those conversions and purchases, based on the changes that we made to our site, right? Because it's not just an intellectual exercise. We're in this to achieve certain goals, which are conversions and very often it's revenue, but it might just be, it might be increased satisfaction or increase, speed, or whatever it may be. Okay, so that's the data piece. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing, and we're going to go back to Andrew to wrap us up.
Great. All right. Okay. Look at that, seamless transitions. We're getting good at this. So, all right. Curious in the chat. I'm curious to hear where 5 means you love working in spreadsheets and 1 means you'd literally do anything else. I'm just sort of curious to take the temperature of our folks here. Let me open the chat here. We got a lot of 4s, 3s. Okay. All right. I'm impressed. I'm a 1. Y'all know I'm not really a 1, but yeah, some 3s and 4s and 5s. That's pretty good. Robin's coming in with the 0. Okay. Well, to those of you who are lower on the scale, if you're going to do your own audit, you're going to have to get to love a spreadsheet. But again, I want to emphasize, for example, say you engage with an agency like Mighty Citizen to do your audit. The actual thing you would get back, in addition to sort of a document that is more narrative, you'd get the actual spreadsheet back. And the one we use for those engagements is one of those longer, more detailed ones. What I wanted to do, especially for today, is create a template that I thought would be useful for organizations doing it on their own, and especially if you have sort of limited manpower, person power, or budget or time, frankly. And the reason for that is because often when an organization does it on their own, they Google how to do a content audit or something like that. They find a template out there that's really bulky. And so getting the data is difficult to find. Now, the good news, that's why we're doing this particular webinar, is that if you're using a tool from Association Analytics, is Acumen, right? Then you're going to have the data. If you don't have a tool like that, it's going to be a lot trickier to have it. Also, often audits ask for stuff that is really irrelevant to day-to-day work. And, to sort of ladder up to our organizational goals, I feel like we have to attack it at sort of the daily, or at least the weekly or monthly level. Sometimes data is misleading. All of you who have really spent time in your website analytics know this. Know that a high bounce rate on a page does not mean that page is no good necessarily. In fact, it could mean just the opposite. So a lot of these have to be data points have to be connected. That's another reason Acumen is so lovely, is it begins to sort of combine some of this data to tell us about things like engagement. And again, some of them are too rigid. So let's look at what we're going to provide and how you should work it. Again, 20% is just a guiding rule. My main point here is to stop spending time evaluating pages on your site that get 4 visits a year, which, by the way, I'm sure that many of you have pages like that. We suggest doing it every quarter and doing it all at once, like within a day or 2 if possible. Now, if you have a larger site, then you can do what we call a rolling audit. So you do roughly a quarter of your auditable pages every quarter of the year, so that when a year's passed, you're coming back and doing your second pass on a certain set of pages, if that makes it more manageable. Enlist team members to help, but not too many. Why do I say not too many? Well, in part because you're making subjective calls, and you want to concentrate that subjectivity in as few people as feasible, especially if they're the people that have the authority to make content strategy decisions and changes. Ideally, the highest possible decider would do the bulk of the work, or at least be overseeing it really closely. And we recommend that once you complete the audit, you let it sit in your files for roughly a week or so, and then go back and look at it again. Just read it like you would read any other document. Patterns will likely emerge. That's typically how we do it here at Mighty Citizen, is like we do the hard work of the actual auditing, and then we turn it into some sort of narrative, because that helps us make real decisions, we think. And again, you see me use that word story again there. That's based on pattern and evidence, like the evidence you get from like Acumen. Okay, so let's talk about the actual template. I want to wrap this up in the next 7 or 8 minutes if I can, so we can squeeze in a few questions at the end. So the template we're going to provide, it starts with this. I've just screenshotted little bits of it. It's just too big to show all at once, obviously. Critical to always update the date the minute you make any change to the spreadsheet. Why? Because there's a lot of sort of notes in there, and you want to make sure that those notes or those statuses are attended to, and that you're not overriding something someone else did.
Hey, Andrew, so I
Mm.
apologize. I know you said 7, 8 minutes, but this is an important question. So,
Yeah.
Should there be can multiple people be working on this at once, or is it important that we sort of have some rules and regulations for who can make changes and additions to the audit?
Yeah, I think it's important to have some rules. You don't want to like open up to everybody. As I mentioned a minute ago, I think it's important to keep it in the first pass in the sort of that side of the association, meaning the communication, member experience, development sides. But the more people you get in there, the wider the opinions, especially if you get people in there who are evaluating it without sort of some of the knowledge you have of what you've been doing, what you're doing now. That, in that instance, I think context matters, right? Knowing what marketing has been up to for the last year, 2 years, 5 years, whatever, allows you to make some evaluations and make some, frankly, fill in those little intuitive gaps between what a number may say and what the sort of bottom line that you're tracking, like your membership numbers, your revenue, what have you. So I would limit it. If you can do it, if one person's willing to do the whole thing, I would do that. All right, so first we're going to start with page title, URL, section of site. I've done some fake data in here just to give you an example of what a row might look like. A couple key things I want to point out here. Your page title should be exactly how it appears on the page. Make sure you're looking at the H1, which isn't depending on your web design, isn't necessarily the thing that's in the largest font. It probably is, but you want to double check that because that's what Google is crawling to sort of feed your analytics. Generally, you want keyword-friendly titles and H1s. Again, this is why you need to be doing keyword research, have an SEO plan, so that you're not getting cute with your page titles. You can get cute down the page. Don't get cute with your page titles. Why? Because people will visit those pages less because they'll find them less. Make sure the URL in the actual audit document is clickable because you want to be jumping over to that page quickly instead of having to go find it yourself. And you want to list the section of your site. Typically, this means where, like what top level menu item is this page under? Usually find this in the slug or the URL that is. That's another issue though, I will say. I've seen this with associations, these ridiculously long URLs because the site wasn't developed necessarily as well as it could be. URL should be, you should be able to look at the URL of a page on your site and essentially know what that page is. And there shouldn't be a string of like 1,000 letters and numbers after it. Okay, next things. A type of content. You heard me mention content type earlier. These are just some examples, right? You can make your own, you can fix this to be, whatever your association has in terms of content types. But you want to limit it to a certain list so you're not inventing things as you go, because everything should be a content fit into one of, usually somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 or 6, usually no more than 10 content types. Video would be a type, events would be a type, things like that. The topic of the page, official. So this goes back to having a content strategy. In other words, these are the things we're going to talk about primarily because these are the things that our constituents care about. And you need to be able to look at a page and identify which topic it's addressing. If a page doesn't address a sort of established topic, in other words, it seems a bit of a digression or doesn't ladder up to an obvious topic that we've identified as important to our members, something needs revision. I know I'm moving through this quick. Honestly, most of this, once you get your hands on the template, it's pretty self-evident. I just wanted to offer some tips along the way. This is a critical one. Ideal user action on this page. Make sure it's an action. It's not enough to just say, we want to teach them about our upcoming conference, or we want to tell them what they need to study for this class. There should be something we ideally would like them to do, and that's usually clicking through to another page, filling out a form, clicking a button to donate or to sign up or to join or renew or what have you. It doesn't mean that you're going to drive that entire page to do that, but the simple act of identifying putting myself in the mind of this user, they've read this, they've seen this, they've watched this, what ideally would I like them to do? And by the way, this will often be where you find most of the things you're like, I don't know what we wanted them to do, because we don't really, our website isn't really set up that way. In other words, it's not designed, the layouts aren't there. But again, we want to be driving them constantly to those handful of key organizational goals. Okay, next column, next step. Keep it simple. Usually it's just keep as is, update, or delete/archive. Be sure to update this field if you update the page. In other words, you go, this page is out of date. It's an event that happened a year ago, or it's some advocacy thing we were talking about that is no longer relevant because that law got passed or it didn't get passed or whatever. We're going to delete it. We'll make sure if it's marked as deleted, that's why it's also, by the way, critical to have the last updated date. So, like, okay, this one is keep as is. I'm going to mark that I did that, right? I am curious in the chat why you would delete a page from your site. We might not have time to dig into that, but it's an interesting thing. Like, what are good reasons for your association to actually remove a page? Couple last things here. Contributors. We talked about this a second ago, so I'm not going to say a ton about it. But to someone's point, I think someone was like, that seems just prohibitive, and I get it, to do this for every single person. I would say if it's really hard for your association to list the people involved in a page of content, there's a possibility that might be that might reveal that you've got too many cooks in that particular kitchen and might be able to find ways. It doesn't necessarily mean that, but it could mean that, and we've seen that plenty. Last few things. Visits to this page the last calendar year. Now, this is sort of a stand-in for all sorts of analytics. As Bill just showed us, there's all sorts of data we could pull in here. And I'm using this one as sort of a high level, like, people get this, especially if you're sharing your audit with a committee or your leadership or your board. They kind of get things like visits, right? So, but you can add things, other things, of course, as well, like conversion rate, bounce rate, time spent on page, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, this would be a good spot for, if you do have some of those analytics for like just a simple line graph, right? So like, visits in a calendar year, that's pretty high level,
Yeah.
But if I just have like a simple line graph showing the trend in visits over the year, I think that would be something that would add an appropriate level of context for like decision makers, right? I mean, they don't necessarily need to know the exact number because that's out of context.
Yeah.
Maybe we had 10,000 last year. 2,800 seems like a lot.
Yeah.
But if we have a trend line or something, then that's going to be helpful if you have it.
Yeah, great point. Then also word count. I've included a link in the template to a simple online word counter. Why is this relevant? Well, there's no magic rule for word length on a web page, but if you begin to notice that the pages that are longer seem to be trending well or attracting more visits, or frankly, getting more organic visitors from search, that can be really telling. But generally speaking, the more words, the less users will read. That is, we know that from thousands of examples of UX eye tracking software. So we want to keep our pages really singular in purpose. And then finally, the grade level of text. I wish I could get into my whole spiel here, but the average American adult reads at an 8th grade level. So if the text on a page of your site is above 8th grade, more than half of the people who read it won't be able to comprehend it. That's the translation of that statistic. So you need to be rating on the grade level of all of your pages and making sure that you're ideally below 8. The sweet spot, in my experience, is right around 7. I would say 8.5 at the upper limit. The more and more you go above 8, the sort of exponential the drop off is in comprehension. These are things that we often don't think about, But again, as we said earlier, I don't care how beautiful your message is. And I know you all have really compelling association stories, but if the format, the comprehensibility, the readability, the findability are bad, no one's ever going to really consume that. I'm going to skip past this. And I want to jump. This is sort of a summary slide, so we won't review it because we are at the end. I apologize for that. But if y'all want to say, if anyone wants to say a few minutes extra, I'm happy to. I'm sure Bill is too, to answer any questions. If you go to mightycitizen.com/content-audit, you can get your hands right away on not only this audit template in an Excel format, but along with a bunch of other tools we put together that are all free and stuff. And of course, associationanalytics.com/relevant-content will provide a lot of additional resources and make sure you're using and gathering that data in a useful way. Whew, I know I've been talking a million minutes an hour here.
Good work.
Yes,
Good work.
we did it. But does anybody have any questions while we have a few minutes here? And again, if we need to go over, otherwise, to those of you who have to go, all the best. Thanks for joining us today. Appreciate you.
Yeah, while we're waiting for questions, there's just one by way of kind of key takeaways. I wanted to just say that we kind of touched on this at the beginning, is that great content is not the goal per se, right? It's how you get there, right? So your goals are user experience, their revenue, their engagement, their mission, and all of that. And the content is the vehicle, right? But we have to, we have to audit and we have to improve and all of that in order to get to all those other goals we have. There's a question about blog posts, Andrew. So is that that's part of content, right? I mean, that's
absolutely. I think blogs is depending on how they fit into your organization's larger strategy, like what role they play. Yeah, absolutely, they're critical and seem to be becoming more and more popular for organizations all the time. I'll give you an example here at Mighty Citizen. Obviously, we're not an association, but we the bulk of our marketing efforts come through our blog and our tools. Like if you just go to mightycitizen.com/insights, you'll just find like hundreds and hundreds of blog articles, bunch of free templates, bunch of free tools, webinars, stuff like that, right? So like we treat blogs like we would any other page on our site. In fact, we probably, if we were doing an audit and we were looking at our 20% of pages, I would guess 18 of the 20% would be some form of blog page. So yeah, I think it absolutely applies.
So I have a question then. So I think a lot of us, associations or vendors, wherever, we invest a lot in good blog content. So my question is, what's the shelf life, typically of a blog post, right? So at what point do I want to look at that and say, well, I should really update this, or maybe I should retire it because that information, I know it depends on the information, but as a rule of thumb, how often would you look at those?
Well, so a couple of things would influence my decision about whether to do anything with an existing blog article. The first is how it's ranking on Google search results. So I'll give you an example. We have one we published years ago called How to Optimize a PDF for Search. That was the name of the blog article. It quickly shot to the top of Google search for a key term. And so what we've done is about every year and a half or so, we'll go in and add a little bit, tweak a bit. If anything's inaccurate, we'll take it out, add new stuff in. But we don't mess with it too much, especially the top of the page, which is especially important to search results, because we want to keep it in those top 3 search results for that term, because that was a big win for us. So one is, how is it ranking? How is it performing, right? The other thing I would think about is, does it seem to be like, okay, so there's a performance on search, but there's also performance in terms of like creating some sort of journey through the website. So I would look at a blog article and I would say, for whatever reason, do people have a greater tendency when they're on this, reading this blog, to click through to somewhere else on our site? In other words, is that conversion high? And if it is, then I'm probably not going to mess with it much, because for fear of breaking something that isn't, or that isn't broken. So I would look at those 2 things first. And then of course, there's the question of just pure accuracy. If something's just no longer true, then of course you have to change it. It's like our responsibility. So that's my initial take on that.
And if it's still trending high, it's getting good results and everything. Does the fact that it has an old date on it, does that bother you, or would you update that, or do you not date it in the first place, or how do we deal with that?
It's such a great question. We were debating this internally on a project just yesterday. Do you put dates on your blog? So I'm very ambivalent about this question. I think it depends a large part on the association and their types of members and the type of things they're putting on their blog. Generally, my take is this. I tend to default to yes, include dates. Why? Because people like to know that this is not from 7 years ago.
Yeah.
They like things that are newer. And I'll say that for us, we will update the date on things sometimes, even if we don't really touch it, because we've looked at it, we've decided it's still true and relevant, and therefore we want to indicate that to people. But there is an argument for leaving dates off for that very reason. Like, we don't want people to see something that's old and assume it's wrong. So they'll see it and they'll be like, well, I don't see a date, so maybe I'll trust it anyway. But it is a endless debate in the UX world.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I think Frank's right. People assume it's old if you don't put the date on it. So.
Yeah, I think they tend to, especially the savvier users. I think that's very true. But if you're a tiny association who can't constantly be, updating, you're just trying to create new stuff, you might leave it off in some cases. But yeah, I default with yes. If you update but leave date, do you say edited? That's a good question, Cindy. I mean, you could certainly. What we have done for ourselves is, if we do a real substantive update, like more than just a line or two or a number or two, then we will start with something to that effect. Like, we'll explain not only when we update it, but we'll explain sort of why. We'll have a little sort of italics or something at the top of the article as an intro. So I think that's a really good point. I think that's worth doing. Content pre-2020 might not be relevant. Yeah, right. Everything's changed. So we might want to go through and update those dates. I will say, try not to update the date if you haven't actually read the article and approved that, okay, this is still all accurate and true and whatnot. We are working with a client. I'll give you an example where we left off dates off blog articles because they have this vast store of old they're more like stories. It's less like teaching you about something. They're like personal stories, and those feel sort of more evergreen, like they'd be true tomorrow, just like they were 10 years ago. So for that particular content type, we leave dates off because we don't want to imply that it's news, and we want to be able to publish them in dribs and drabs over the coming years. Last updated, yeah. Any final questions? I know we're a few minutes over. Appreciate you, those of you who stuck around, the real content heads out there. Bill and my emails are on the screen there. I won't speak for Bill, but I'll say for me, feel free to email me at any time with any. I geek out over this stuff, not just audits, but content, copywriting, user experience design. I'd love to just chat with any of you about any questions you have. Bill, did you have any things you wanted to say here at the end?
Yeah, just that, obviously feel free to reach out. Be glad to hear from anyone that's with us today. On our site, there's a bunch of resources. There's a lot of webinars related to content and just related to performance improvement generally using data. So I encourage you to check those out, and just look out for webinars like this. We generally do them every couple of weeks. Sometimes they're more hands-on, kind of how to do specific things with data, but very often we bring in experts and partners and talk about things that are broadly applicable to association professionals. So hope to see you all again soon.
Yeah, thanks. Bye-bye, everyone. Take care.